Hi, Kate.
Thanks, Melanie. Hi, Rachel.
Congratulations. Before we begin, I just want to remind everybody that Drifts is out today. You can get it from your local indie bookstore. Support them. And I would love to start with a reading. That's what we discussed, right, Kate? So
Yes.
I'm going to turn it over to you to sort of set up the book, give us a little background behind the novel and what you're going to read, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And thank you, Melanie and Center for Fiction. So Drifts follows a year and a half of a narrator's life as she is attempting to write a novel. But instead, she's keeping a notebook and working on different ways of thinking about different ways of seeing and feeling and trying to find like a form to encompass the time that she's living in. And I'm going to read from the second half of the book just for a couple of minutes because it's the same season we're in now, and I'm really struck by the uncanniness of it. In April, a Swedish newspaper wants to profile me because of a new translation of a book I wrote years ago. The morning of the phone interview, I vomit up a green smoothie with surprising recoil. I'm not quite sure what I say to the reporter. I don't feel like the same person who wrote the book she wants me to speak about. And yet I know I wrote the same book from the same body as I have now. The same yet eroding set of memories are past, just as the stomach is the same stomach as when I was a child and as it was a month ago. And yet how it changes, regenerates, stretches, transforms. During the interview, I find myself on a rant about Nosgard, that I can't believe that Sarah Stridsberg's novel on Valerie Solanas had not yet been translated into English. I'd rather read that. I resented that I was supposed to read him. I resented his sexy leather jacket and his sexy leather face. Hanging up the phone, I imagine the inevitable pull quote and feel somewhat ashamed. The Swedish newspaper also wants me to meet a photographer at Chelsea Piers to get my photograph taken. I feel nervous about this as I am bloated and my clothing has mostly stopped fitting me. Since it is still cold, I figure I can just wrap my long black robe coat around me, the new coat that I've just purchased for half off in a winter sale that probably won't fit me for long. It doesn't matter that I got my hair cut and styled for the occasion. The wind is so fierce that in the photograph, my hair is blowing around me as somehow also my skin. The photographers say they want me to be outside, since I apparently spoke about my longing towards the flaneur in the interview. In the photograph they chose, I look bleached out, uncomfortable, not myself. I think of the moment in Camera Lucida when Bart describes getting his author photograph taken, experiencing a kind of vertigo, something of a detective anguish. On my nightstand, Clarice Lispector's extravagant face stares at me from the jacket of her collected stories. I managed to read only one story about the saturated sadness of a mother of small children, the secret center, which was like a pregnancy. The young woman spends an afternoon in bed, then wakes up still having to peel the potatoes and wash the clothes. Then she goes out at night and gets incredibly drunk, the alcohol exuding through her flesh. A word from the story, gravid, meaning pregnant or full of significance. I open Say Sonigan's The Pillow Book, but can't read past the beginning, the description of the dog being beaten. Oh yes, Bonnie replies to me. Total blankness. No reading or writing. I didn't like it. Finally, I could read Maeve Binchy's romance novel set in Ireland. I spend my spare time thinking about the pale yellow fur coat with white dotted trim that many of Vermeer's women wear in his paintings. I page through plastic-coated books that John brings me from the library. The light of Vermeer's paintings, their silence and mystery. So often a woman writing at a desk or reading a letter. How ordinary they are. So often the painting seems to be of the same room at the same picture window. John and I look at the images together, thinking of what time of day is depicted in different paintings, whether the sun floods in directly or diffusely. He takes the day off so we can go to the Met and to the Frick to look at their Vermeers. At the Frick, one of the yellow coat paintings, the mistress and the maid look over a letter. On a nearby table, there is a large vase of lilies, the smell overpowering the room. I feel dizzy. I sit in the tropics room, a sort of glassed-in courtyard, the water rushing, and stare at all the green. Looking at the Vermeers, I'm reminded of my conversations with Sophia from the fall, how to empty a text in order to fill it.
Thank you. Before we start, I just wanted to say that reading your book brought me such peace in this time. There's something about it.
Well.
At the same time, though, I found myself furiously scribbling in the margins every time you would make a reference to another book that I wanted to read through your book. And I thought maybe we could start there because you just mentioned in that passage 7, 9 other authors, little clips, little references. It's something I love about your work so much, which is that through it, I discover so much other work that I want to read. How are you pulling these things from your mind? I mean, do you have just a running list of sort of fragments, things you've read that you want to put into the text? Are you looking at a document? How are you pulling from all these different little threads to put a passage like that together?
Well, I think that I tend to reread things over and over again. And I think a lot of the energy of Drifts was actually feeling an intense reading allergy for a long period of time. So I and when I feel that sort of reading allergy, I tend to just more look at a book over and over again, like that copy of the Clarice Lispector collected stories, the New Directions one with her face. Yeah. I bought that at the beginning of my pregnancy when I couldn't read anything, and it just stared at me from my nightstand. So actually in that selection, I'm just reading one story and then stopping. So I think I'm really interested in my writing depicting like the voluptuousness of a reader and like the sense of like loving, holding something or carrying something around, but not always being able to read it. Something like the Bart I return to so many times and I keep on rereading it. So that's why it's kind of like etched in my head. So that comes up pretty easily when I'm writing. But other things like the conversation with the friend Banu, who's based on the wonderful writer Banu Kapil, it's mostly about how I couldn't read anything in my pregnancy. So I kept on thinking of like, what could I read? And finally I began reading Flaubert's Sentimental Education for all the details of clothes, and all the, details of the types of mustard. So I think I'm a very voluptuous reader. And so there are a few books I'm constantly carrying around with me. Like in the beginning of Drifts, I keep on saying that I'm reading Robert Walser's The Tanners, but I never finished it. Yeah. But it will take me months and months. And I think the reason why it makes its way so much into the work is because I'm literally just carrying around these books. So because often it's like this vertigo or this pull where I can't read them because I'm almost...
Yeah, I love that idea of a voluptuous reader. It's interesting when you talk about carrying books around because, right now, so many of us are not going anywhere. And I think one of the things I miss the most is this idea of putting in a book in my bag and never reading it. That sense,
yeah, exactly.
But the sense of like, this is the thing that's going to come with me spiritually, even if I never crack the pages. And it's funny, I fully read your book, but I was looking for the galley. Actually, I have a hardcover version here, but someone sent me a galley a few months ago, I think in January, and it was one of the last books I carried around with me in a tote bag before we could no longer carry books around in a tote bag and go anywhere on the train. And I remember thinking like Drifts came with me in this time. And if I were to write my own Drifts, there would be some passage about how like your book was moving with me through a space I can no longer move through. So I just thought that was
I love that.
Elegiac. But I also want to talk about in that passage, you mentioned the, regrettable pull quote. So I wanted to sort of like put that foreground that and say, probably the pull quote people ask about this book is what makes it a novel. And I want to ask you about that because, in this book, the writer lives in a neighborhood where you do live and has a partner with the same name as your partner, and has similarities, but obviously this is a work of fiction. There's invention, there's imagination, there's sort of electricity and capricity to it. But I wanted to ask you sort of where the fiction comes in and how sort of that the fictional mind works for you.
Yeah, totally. You know, it's funny, when I was writing heroines, when I was writing heroines for a while, I thought of it as a novel, and I kept the character's name John because John is the name of the husband in Yellow Wallpaper. So it was a very referential thing that I think has carried over. It's a really good question. And I think the question makes me think a lot about like what I write and what I like about writing and like what tradition I'm trying to write in. I actually think the pull quote people talk the most about is when I talk about a genius grant winner. That seems to be repeated throughout all the reviews. But I think me thinking of Driss as fiction is different than me calling it a novel, right? So when I think of the impulse for Driss to feel like fiction, which I think is, I also called the screen test fiction, and I thought of the screen test as stories as well. And I think that's more where I'm thinking towards in some way. Is, for me, fiction is about, you know, a body moving through time and space and like exploring different spaces. And it's about a gaze and a sensibility and a sense of atmosphere and mood. And I think that, to me, it's less about imagination, because I have almost no imagination. Like, I'm not a very imaginative writer, but it is about, once I wrote this character, the narrator became I, but not I. Sure, autobiographical, but it was more about an I exploring different spaces. There's an essay by Renee Gladman, which I think to a lot, that's collected in the anthology Biting the Air, which kind of looks at new narrative writing, and it's called The Person in the World. And she talks about her desire towards prose and narrative versus story. And like that, to her, narrative is about an I who may or may not be autobiographical, thinking in language. And so for me, calling it fiction, when I call something fiction, it often gives me more permission to explore the unfamiliar and to explore the mysterious and to explore a sort of nervous system of a sensibility. Now, calling it a novel is somewhat projected by publishing a little bit. It's somewhat like, I knew it was going to be a novel, and I think part of me wrestled with what that meant, because there's another part of me that's very drawn to the essay. And I think Driss could definitely be called an essay about time in the body. But I think a novel is a really capacious structure. And I think the history of the novel is a pretty monstrous form that allows for biography and allows for prose poetry and allows for letters and allows for diaries and allows for the essay.
Right.
So,
I mean, it's omnivorous. It takes in a lot of things, but it's also a form that feels kind of like the top of a mountain in a lot of ways. I mean, you look at a lot of writers and they're saying, I'm working on the novel, like they're pursuing it like a bear.
Right. Exactly. And I think I'm playing a little bit with that pursuit. Like, what is a novel? You know, and I think my idea, I like Eileen Myles. I think she said this in the same anthology, actually, that she calls her works novels because a novel is meant to be read from beginning to the end, that it follows like a narrator. And I think, you know, I think within the tradition of like what Semiotext publishes or New Narrative or the French Auto Portrait or like the near fiction published by Dorothy, I see Driss within that tradition. So maybe it's a novel, it's desiring towards a novel and it's ambivalent towards a novel, but I definitely see it in the space of fiction.
Yeah. And I think that's enough. I think that also there's a sense of, you know, people are very didactic about the novel, even though it can be so many things. And it's a form that does want to take in history and art history and poetry and biography and all of these different things. But then they say, well, if it doesn't have a rip-roaring plot, how's it a novel? And, you know, in my mind, I think Driss does have a plot. I mean, it's exploratory, but it's thinking through a mental state, and like you said, a season or a year really in a body, and the changes that it undergoes. But I mean, what is your feeling about sort of like plotting when it comes to fiction?
Well, there is that joke where I say the publishers ask, like, who are the characters in the novel and does anything happen? And I love works like Claire Louise Bennett's Pond, where it's really about exploring like mood and sensibility.
Yeah.
But the truth is like, there is narrative. There are like a couple of mysterious events. And I think that in Drifts, the thing that really makes it fiction to me is a sort of like nervous consciousness where the narrator feels like everything's connected. Right. Everything's connected.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's like a code. My friend Sophia Samatar, who's one of the chief correspondents in Drifts, who she has this parallel companion book called Chamber Writing, which is about the same letters I write about in Drifts that that's a manuscript now. But she often has she's a fantasy writer, but her works read like essays. And she has this idea of the quotidian and the code, that like she loves her work to feel daily and every day and like nothing, like just the stuff. Yeah. But then there's like a sense that things are coded from the outside. And to me, Drifts has that paranoia and has that sense of like mystery to it.
Right. I agree. I feel like even from the first few passages, you're like, there's something eerie going on here. I'm not quite sure what it is. Something is haunting this person. She can't do the things she's supposed to do. She's distracted. Right. I think it actually fits into like what I, feel like is a pretty strong genre that's been emerging in the last 5 years, which I would think of as like literature of anxiety.
Yes,
I think of everybody from Alexandra Kleeman to, sometimes Leslie Jameson or Maggie Nelson or people who are just like working through anxiety on the page. I mean, obviously that has been done for centuries, but I think there is something really like sort of modern and contemporary about sort of like buzzing on the page.
Yeah, and it's interesting because so many of us are so interested in like Renata Adler's Speedboat and Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Nights, like all these very, very nervous works from the 70s. So I feel like we've almost internalized them. And then this is like... Or like
Joan, who says that she's anxious, but like really is the most confident writer alive.
Right, exactly. Like this idea, of like breaking up and that sense of breaking up. And I think to me, there's a really speculative quality in Drifts. It's light. It's not like I love Alexander Kleeman, but it's not... everything feels daily in Drifts, but it is very pattern that the narrator is like seeing literature everywhere is, it's life and it's not life.
Well, I want to talk about its relationship to your nonfiction because, I mean, obviously Heroines is one of my favorite books. You and I are both obsessed with it.
Well, thank you.
No, I mean, like from that book, I went and read everything that could possibly be there to be read about Vivian Elliott and like figured, tried to sort of chase that rabbit all the way down the hole, but also just all the women that you mentioned in that book. And I mean, that's a book about anxiety too, but it just as it transposed kind of onto biographical work and really sort of thinking through these women's lives. And I wonder sort of how you relate what you do in nonfiction to fiction in terms of research and sort of bringing in outside sources.
Yeah. It's interesting because Heroines for quite some time was a novel that was called Mad Wife. And it was very much like, it was very self-knowing and arch that the character acted like a 19th century nervous narrator. Like it was very self-conscious of like being in literature, which I guess is maybe not that dissimilar from Drifts. And I worked on it for a long time and I was really inspired by works like Ingberg Bachmann's Melina. But then when Chris Cross and Editorial Colty approached me for a book, which was like the luckiest thing that ever happened to me, but they said they wanted it to be nonfiction. I was like, sure, yes, definitely. And I added more research. I mean, it came out of a lot of research, but in my heart, Heroines always kind of is fiction that was exploring an essay. And I think I learned a lot from the experience of how Heroines was read. Because I always found the narrator of Heroines ridiculous. Like, I think there was always there was always a sensibility I was exploring of excessiveness and almost like this like femininity I was putting on that felt ghostly or haunted. But yeah, so Heroines is like, it is nonfiction, but it's one of my works classified as nonfiction that I actually think if it had been published as fiction, it might have been read in a different way. Probably not, but.
Well, I think that there's a certain kind of nonfiction that has a lot of style, which I would put your work in that category, where it's kind of written by a character, even though the facts check out. I mean, I kind of see my work that way. Like whatever shows up on the page is like the character of the writer, Rachel, like whoever that is. Although I'm a journalist, so like the reporting's all there, but like the character that wrote it, I feel like is a different person than like the person who makes dinner or goes to bed and gets up and brushes her teeth, you know?
I read like for 6 months for Heroines. I don't even know why. I read like hundreds and hundreds of books for Heroines. I did not do the same sort of research for Driss. I mean, Driss was more like idiosyncratic research where I had just some authors and some books and some films that I kept on rewatching. So it was a very different process. And I think when I write essays now, I do research them, but they are more like a few books I'm looking at the time that I kind of put them in conversation with each other. So an essay, I think when I write essays now, they tend to be in a more of an elegiac mode. And I do differentiate them from fiction. But I think, like I was just rereading Andre Gide's journals, which I love, from the 20s and the 30s. And he said, I mean, I guess people would call his work autofiction, but they don't now. But he wrote, you know, every single one of my books has been the exploitation of an uncertainty. And I think more than fiction or nonfiction, that when I write something, there's usually some uncertainty that I'm needing to mine somehow. And so I need to write it to figure it out.
Yeah. That's another like Joan thing. Like I write to figure out what I think about the world. And I wanted to ask, I mean, actually this question comes to you via my friend Sinead Gleason in Ireland, who's on British time now. And you know, she loves your work and is sleeping, but will tune in tomorrow. So I'm glad I'm asking this question for Sinead on Sinead's behalf. But I want to talk about sort of like the sort of, I don't want to say diminishment, because of course I think feminine is divine, but like this sort of like idea of like taking a work that isn't fully that is in fragments, or that has personal, or that has kind of like working through anxiety, or like you said, working through uncertainty, and a lot of those books are now classified as like women's work, or this is a kind of essay that you know, there's a certain kind of like femaleness to this work, which I think is really strong and powerful. But I think in a lot of ways, there's all this sort of idea that like the essayists, like the personal essay girls, or the women who are doing this kind of work. And I wonder what you think about that, about sort of like this sort of like deciding that this kind of work is feminine.
Yeah, I think it's really ahistorical to decide that sort of work is feminine. And I think what I think is interesting is that when there are celebrated male writers who mine the autobiographical, a lot of work is done on the part of mostly male reviewers to situate them in the literature of the greatest of men.
Right.
You know, there's so much aggressive work done to provide context, to situate certain people within, you know, the passivity and doubt of Robert Walser, or the neurasthenic narrator of W.G. Sebald. But when women write, they're often considered completely outside of that tradition, even if they read those writers too and they're inspired by those writers. I think that, you know, doubt and uncertainty is a whole tradition of literature. And I think that, you know, there are many women writers who are doing the most exciting work of thinking on the page now, and thinking with, you know, thinking through on the page as, you know, a body in time and space. And I think, you know, like, I know like the whole debate about personal essays, but I think it's interesting to assume always, I'm going to turn it and say, it's really something to assume always when someone uses I, that they're being purely autobiographical or personal, when I is actually an incredibly humble way to explore ideas. You know, like it's a way to actually explore philosophy. And so, you know, I think we have to gird ourselves with various traditions and realizing, you know, that we are thinking on the page in embodied and, you know, voluptuous ways and ways that are full of doubt. And that's philosophy. You know, I think Sarah Manguso once said in a panel on fragmented writing, it's published online as the F Word, and it's with Maggie Nelson and Eula Biss and Manguso. And she said, you know, to write the self in a book is possibly, you know, to write all the stuff of the existential crisis of the self. And that is valuable in and of itself. And I think it's deeply suspect when that type of writing is dismissed as, like, of course it's personal. Like, it's personal, but we also can be writing ideas with great feeling. And there's no reason those things need to be separate. And I'm a little fatigued sometimes with the concept that the only thinkers in our contemporary who are taken seriously are the ones who seem like they're great debaters, as opposed to admitting they don't know something. And I think saying you don't know and approaching through the spirit of unknowing is a profound philosophical position to take.
I absolutely agree. Speaking of not knowing, I don't know if I should turn my lights on or not. Am I a little dark now? The sun's starting to.
Mm-hmm.
Hang on.
It's a little dark, yeah.
Okay, hang on. We are going to get the twinkle lights on.
Oh.
In the office. Look at that. Hello, back again. So what I wanted to say, so I think you're totally right. And I think this idea, like you said, of just great debaters versus, in a way, like my favorite writing, yours included, I think has this idea that I always talk about, which is like, if your mind is a museum, what I want is somebody to walk through it as if they're looking at the exhibitions and just thinking about what they think about it, rather than being a docent and being like, this is what this means. Like,
totally.
Do you know what I mean? But still
guiding
you through it. Like, they know their way around the museum. It's not like they're lost, like it's their first time. But there is a sense of like, I don't know how I feel about this picture. How do you feel? It makes me angry. I don't know why it makes me angry. Let me think about that. And yet at the same time, you understand the history of the painting. You understand what's going on. So that it's almost like a really informed guide, but somebody who is not like, this is what this means, and this belongs in the canon of art history because of this. I always find that I like the gentle guidance through the world rather than this didactic thing. And I think that might be the difference between this idea that's like, what's coded male, what's coded female in writing.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, there's like a specific novel that begins with looking at an artwork that I'm thinking of. And yeah, it's, to me, like, I'm so interested in actually literally writing about art and what it's like to look at art and what it's like to encounter something in a museum or just to encounter. And to me, to actually describe the spirit of encounter and an openness to it, as opposed to being cynical about the experience of art as being potentially transformative. I mean, I think these are different sensibilities. And I agree. I would much rather someone walk with me and think with me on the page than tell me what to think or tell me how much they know, which I don't find that interesting.
Yeah, and there's no one way. I mean, minds are just webs of connection. And I think what I really love about Drifts and your whole body of work is that the connections in your mind are so alive and so idiosyncratic that nobody else but you would have thought of putting together. I mean, even in the passage that you read, bringing Maeve into it, bringing, Bart into it, and then linking the two through literally 3 paragraphs of idea. I mean, like, the jump from there to there is something that only your brain could make. And I think that's always what I like about writing, is like seeing the connections that somebody could make. Only the like the web is really where the writing is for me.
Yeah, I think of drifts as a lot about trying to reproduce thinking in language, and thinking about that spider's web, and thinking about writing as just following connections. And that's what interests me too, is that sense of like a synaptic impulse when someone is actively trying to think. But I think nowadays people think that means that writing should have a thesis or should be successfully arguing something in a work of fiction or even in an essay. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that writing that has a thesis can be pretty boring.
Well, and I always say when you start with your thesis, you're already putting yourself at a disadvantage, because you'll never get more creative than the thesis. That becomes the feeling. Whereas if you start with a random idea, you can work your way to something that resembles a thesis, especially if you're writing nonfiction. But along the path, you're going to, there's a lot on the way to grandma's house, and I think there is, for example, I always tell people, they're like, where do I start this essay? Where do I think, and I say, literally start with a memory or a day or a color or the way a piece of fabric feels or a smell or a random date from someone's life that you found in an archival newspaper, and write through the day in their life. And by the way, you'll get where you're going, because like, you have to show up at the party. You RSVP'd. This piece is about loss, right? But if you start with like, what does loss mean to me? You're already, you know what I mean? But if you start with like the day that Proust's mother died, and he was like so sad, and you just look at what that day in his life was like and how it had reverberated through the rest of his life, maybe he won't even be in your piece, but you will have like thought through something so like far away from where you're trying to go that by the time you arrive back at your own place, it's like you've been on a drive. And I feel like your writing is so exemplary when it comes to that kind of like seeing the drive.
Yeah, I think it's about the movement.
Okay, apparently they can't see me.
They can't see you. Oh no.
I'm gonna try to come back. It says I can be seen. Let me try to see myself again. Am I back, you guys?
I see you.
You see
no,
me.
I'm little.
How are we doing? Is everybody there? No, you can hear me, but I'm missing. Melanie, are we gone? Am I back?
We're back. Yeah.
Thumbs up?
I think so, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
I like the spirit of openness when approaching a work.
They're telling me they can't see me. Melanie, should I go away and come back?
I think it's seems like some people can see you and some of us can't. I think we should just go forward with hearing you, and it's going to go in and out a little bit, but let's just keep moving forward.
Okay. I'm just double checking. It says I know you can't see me.
We're waiting for Rachel to connect.
You're
doing all these magic tricks.
I pressed the thing. Okay, we were talking about how your mind is so amazing when it comes to like these quick fire.
Well, I actually think I'm really slow though. I think of some people who are writing, and I can see them think on the page, and they seem so quick fire and they seem so fast, and I'm actually really slow, but I just like stew on things for a long time. So like drifts, like I think that passage, like the going from Maeve Binchy to Bart, I mean the Maeve Binchy was Banu Kapil, but like for me, I just maybe had that as a fragment and then worked it over for a long period of time. So I really wanted drifts to feel like thought, and to have the texture of it and to feel very like live and have a lightness to it. But I really kind of labored over everything for a while. I envy very quick writing.
I think a lot of people that tune into readings always want to know like process questions. So I'm just going to ask, you know, how was this book composed? How long did it take you? What time of day do you write? Do you have rituals? I love to hear about these kinds of
I love to hear about it too. I love hearing about process. So, I mean, I've been at work on the book since the entire time I've lived in New York, which is probably 8 years. So, I think that Drifts begins in 2012. I'm not sure. Now I don't know. No, that doesn't make sense. I don't know. We'll have to look. But I did work on it for probably 5 or 6 years. I was under contract for it for about 8 years. And
for this particular book?
For Drifts. Cal Morgan was at Harper and he bought it as a concept. And I was like, okay, now I have to write it, basically. I wouldn't really recommend doing that for peace of mind. And but yeah, I had to really figure out what kind of book I wanted to write. And it took me a really long time to figure out like a book that was a novel that I wanted to put out into the world. And so Drifts was a lot of notes for a very long time. And I kind of was in this real state of like, I think one of the things I'm thinking through in the book is whether that spirit of unworking is actually a very creative state, that I was like composing notes. I was thinking about seeing. I worked on the biographical sections about Rilke for a very long time. And then, so Sketches of Animals and Landscape was the first half of the book. And that was really what I thought the book was, except there wasn't really enough for me to, I didn't know what it was. And then when I got pregnant, I just basically, the whole time I was pregnant, just reshuffled Sketches of Animals and Landscape over and over. For a long time, this opening passage was what I worked on over and over again. And then...
So you're a worker.
Yeah, I worked really, really hard on Drifts. The time I was like most working on it was when I had a newborn, and I realized I had to get this done. So I just kind of worked constantly on it. But it took a couple years to actually make it into a real work. And then I probably revised it for 2 solid years. So I kind of reworked it. I reworked many of these fragments like over and over and over again for a long time. It's probably the most I've ever worked on a book.
That's amazing that you're able to do so many revisions.
Well, Cal Morgan made me. I mean, it was kind of like, he's a great editor and a great reader. And, at the point, probably like 2 years ago when he was interested in taking it on at Riverhead, we really reworked it. Like the whole structure used to be totally different.
Was that daunting to have to rework the entire book?
Yeah, it was crazy. It was, originally I had this whole concept that I wanted Drifts to be like Sebald's Vertigo, which is his least successful work, but it's like these 2 essays and then juxtaposed with this like first person diary-esque material. And so I had this whole like essay on Kafka that was in it. The Rilke essay was like all one thing that you read. And so it was really Cal's idea to chop up the Rilke passages, which took me having to completely rewrite them. And so that's when they became like sort of doors. I mean, I think it's a much better book now, but it was kind of like I had this like one vision for a structure that was probably a little bit more alienating than welcoming. And then like the opening, like the first 20 pages, I rewrote for like 6 months.
Did you ever have any big editorial tussles that you ended up winning? Anything you were dying?
That I ended up winning. Yeah, I'm sure. But yeah, I mean, Cal is a very old school editor. He's a real editor. Like he really, and it's like I would just get these like letters from him about like certain lines, and I think we mostly saw eye to eye. I think there's always a grumble when someone asks you to rewrite something, you know, like you don't want to. But I think he got the vision of the book so much that it was just like hard work, but it was also pretty pleasurable. It's pretty pleasurable for me when I can get to the point where my writing feels like an object that I can just work over and over again.
Like a stone,
and so
polishing it.
I think the only reason I was grumpy about it is because I always have this urge just to go on to new work, as opposed to, you know, I was, you know, dealing with a time period that was several years ago. But I think it was that phase where the book got a lot better.
I just want to encourage everybody in our last few minutes to ask questions in the Ask a Question tab if you have any questions for Kate. I'm going to take questions in about 5 minutes, and then we'll hopefully get to a few. So please drop your questions down here. I have questions, though, still. I want to know sort of what else is inspiring you right now. I mean, we haven't really touched on the current time, which actually is really refreshing because I feel like it's all I think about and all I talk about.
I know. Sometimes I think we go on these like sessions online and I don't have to look at the newspaper during that time. I've been still thinking a lot about animals. I feel like Drifts began this period of thinking about animals and looking at animals. And I saw that piece you linked to about the zoos, which is like very dark and
heartbreaking.
Yeah, but I've been thinking a lot about how we're looking at animals now, like photographs of animals free in the zoo, you know, the animals during the bushfires and the wildfires, and also like having a small child, and up until this happened, taking her to the zoo quite regularly and feeling them to be incredibly melancholy and complicated spaces. So I've been thinking a lot about animals. What else has been inspiring me? I don't know. I feel.
Are you binge watching any TV?
I am. I'm always binge watching TV.
We bond about loving that show, Better Things.
Yeah, I do love Better Things, but to me, Better Things is like literature. It doesn't feel like binge watching. It feels like
so good.
It's so good.
The other day, I tweeted that it was my favorite show about food, and then Pamela.
And she wrote you back. Yeah,
and I was like, I'm gonna pass out.
You have to take her up on that.
When I'm in LA, I just need that.
I've been binge watching Justified, which I've already seen before.
That's a real, like, you're doing it for the binge.
I feel like whenever I'm pregnant, I watch very noirish, violent things. Like I watch like either like Scandinavian noir or like Westerns. And like a lot of people are killing each other. I don't really know why I have this like urge to watch that when I'm pregnant, but I have this like real desire to be spooked because it's like this very spooky, porous time. And I guess this is a very spooky, porous time as well, you know, in terms of the general mood. I don't know. There's something cathartic about it, maybe.
You have so many questions. I'm going to get going on them.
Okay.
Okay. I am going to ask a question from Morgan, who says, thinking about the work you did with Chantal Akerman in Drifts, how do you see the mundane or the quotidian informing your work?
Oh, I love that question. So in many ways, you know, Rachel, you said you wanted to talk about like the dead women we're obsessed with.
Yeah.
But in many ways, I definitely think of all of Drifts as a love letter to Chantal Akerman. And it was an essay I was supposed to write at the beginning of the frame that Drifts begins at. I promised this essay on Chantal Akerman for an anthology. And it was a period of time I wasn't writing or finishing anything. And so I think the entire book, I think one of the jokes or threads through the entire book is that I'm like finally watching the Akerman films. And I think of the whole book as an elegy to her use of, especially her early 70s films, but her use of like the long take and time and space and interiors. And so, I mean, and if artists kind of continue, because I only like, obviously apparently read the same things over and over again. But Ackerman is someone who still is like itching me. Like I wrote an essay on Ackerman for the appendix project. I wrote about News from Home. No, I wrote about No Home Movie. And I'm still really obsessed with her. And I'm still like, a lot of people have said online that how emptied out New York feels now.
Yeah.
Feels a lot like News from Home, and how emptied out the 70s New York was that she filmed. But yeah, I think Ackerman is like one of the main filmmakers that I think through. And I think that I'm often more inspired by film, and especially the concept of a long take in film. And I think that was something I was thinking through a lot.
Yeah, that 70s New York feel. And I want to get to the other questions, but just really quickly, if somebody wanted to get started with watching Chantal Ackerman, what would you recommend?
I would recommend probably News from Home. I think it's like it's probably my favorite of her work. I do a long reading of News from Home in drifts, where I kind of do a deep reading of it. But also Jitu Il El is like very erotic and fun. I like that. But yeah, I think News from Home she's reading out loud letters her mother wrote her. She makes this film in her early 20s when she's in New York. And then she's walking around the city, but she actually filmed it the year later, revisiting these places. And I feel I think it's a film that makes people write a lot when they watch it. Like it's one of those films that have that open space.
All that 70s. I mean, Kate, have you seen Mikey and Nikki, the Elaine May film? I
love that film.
I'd never seen it before. And I was thinking of you actually just because it was one of those like sort of like it, I watched it as like a voluptuous watcher. I was just like, this is so amazing. Elaine May in every way has not been honored in the way she should as a triumphant filmmaker.
No, she hasn't.
Like, I just thought it was that thing where it's like she just lets the shots take as long as they take.
Yeah. And I think like when Barbara
that's what Cassavetes did, and I was like, she just put Cassavetes in a film and made a better Cassavetes. Whatever. Anyways.
Totally. No, Elaine May is amazing.
I want to ask a question that comes from another Rachel that says, all of your notes, do you usually know what book they're going to go in? For example, are they going to go in the current book, or do you have some kind of organizational system for notes for future books?
For a while, one of my chief crises as a writer was never knowing what book I was working on and always perversely wanting to work on multiple books, which is a dumb thing. Like I have no idea why, but I always was like, well, this has to be in this book and this has to be in that book.
Yeah, that's another question. I'm gonna put them together because a process question that was asked also was, how are you working on multiple projects at one time? So I think maybe
it's how my mind works. It's like I have to, and I always have done this, that I have to, I think for me to make a book its own work, I have to say, well, this stuff can't be in it. So then that stuff has to go somewhere else. And so I've always played like this game with myself like that. And I don't know why. I always need to be working on 3 things at the same time, even if it takes 8 years to write any of them. And so it always goes in periods. But to answer Rachel's question, like Driss was part of a book called Switzerland for years. And all I did was torture people about, I would say, oh, I want to write this book that's basically about just walking around my neighborhood and looking at feral cats. And everyone was like, that does not sound like a book. Or I want to write this other book. And I don't know why I saw them as together, but often I have to separate things in order to write. And that separation is writing. But I think I've gotten a little better at knowing what is actually a book versus desiring to have autobiographical material exist somewhere. And I think I've gotten a little better.
Torturous impulse though, where you're like, I have to cheat on one project with another.
I always cheat. And I think that's why I've published too much, just because I'm like a big cheater that I never want to write what I'm supposed to. Like,
see, I cheat a lot. I don't publish enough, but I totally do that.
You publish tons.
But it's one of those things where I'm always
but
the most sexy project is the one that's over the hedge. And I want to be working on that. And the thing that's due tomorrow. I don't want to be working on that. It's not great. Sorry, editors, if you're watching.
Yeah, the contract that I'm supposed to be writing is never what I want to work on, because I always have this dream, and it's something my friend Sophia and I speak about a lot, is like a dream of like this book that feels totally ours and totally private. And I think once you have to write it, it becomes something else, right? Then you have to think of it in a different way.
The clock starts ticking, and no, it's like in the world in a way. Okay, I have a question from Jacqueline, who says, "Hi, Kate. My first novel's coming out this fall, and I'm incredibly nervous, especially now that book promotion looks so different than it did a few months ago. How does it feel to promote this book virtually? And any tips for a debut author? I'm a big fan."
Oh, congrats.
Are you there, Kate?
I think Rachel would be really, I feel like did I go away?
Did you cut out again?
I'm here.
I'm here.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Just go.
I feel like when I was a debut author, I was like really online, really promoting myself. I had a blog. I did a tour. So I think for like the first few books, I really tried to just like form connections with other people and connections with other writers. I did a ton of interviews. I think I wouldn't worry too much about, I know it's hard to think about now as being different, but I think there's a lot of possibilities for connecting online with having a book out now. And I'm hopeful in the fall, like situations with bookstores, et cetera, will feel different. So don't lose faith. I think it's good to meet other writers, to read other writers, to be in conversation with them. And I think, having a book out will hopefully do that.
All right. I'm going to do 2 more questions. Do you have time for that?
Yeah.
This one comes from Will H. And he says, "Kate, I was wondering if you could speak to the way you use Rilke's novel, The Notebooks of Malte Laurids Brugge, as an armature of sorts that affords your work some structure and a consequent freedom to meander."
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of my work right now is, I think I know this, Will. Hi, Will. But I think so much of my work right now is thinking through biography. And so, I mean, a lot of Drifts is a conversation about how Rilke took a decade to write Notebooks of Malte Laurids Brugge, which he called Journal of My Other Self. And it was obviously a fictionalized character, this Danish nobleman, but it was also based on his letters and his journals. And so for me, Drifts is not all first person, but it has these sort of like doors or like elliptical self-portraits. And that's a lot of like the form for the book, that you move into these other selves. And I do wonder what it's like to read that. But for me, the concept was like for it to feel kind of elliptical, but to be the sense of the narrator being haunted by Rilke, but also seeing it as like a spiritual self-portrait. But I saw them as doors. For a while, it was all one piece, and that felt different. But they're like these little interludes. And I think to answer what it does is like, I need a reader to really tell me. I know what I want it to feel like as a writer, but I think for a reader, it could feel many different ways to encounter those passages.
Yeah, no. I think we have time for one more question, and it's from Farah. And Farah says, "I would love to hear more about how you work with a somewhat structureless or not entirely cohesive work, how you trust it will become what you envision, and how you manage the expectations of yourself. Do you ever end up confused about the distinctions between self and narrator and character? Is there something you could say about whether you've worked to either lean in to avoid pathologizing or judging yourself, narrator, or characters on a personal or political level?" That's a lot of question, but it's kind of
very complicated question.
Like the relationship between the self, the character, the writer, and giving yourself permission to be sometimes not cohesive.
I think that it helps when you pass outside the time period that you're writing about, if you're writing autobiographically, because then it becomes just about the actual manuscript and the actual work. and then you can start thinking about a narrator. But for me, Driss was always like a feeling that I knew that that whenever I felt like ghostly, or like that ghostly feeling, which was also a very sensual, voluptuous feeling of being out in the world, I knew that was like a Driss feeling. And so I really just wanted a work that somehow contained that sensibility. But it was a pretty uncohesive project for a long time. And often when I'm working on a project, I will go through a period of time where if I explain it to anyone else, they have no idea what I'm talking about, where it doesn't really make sense. Like, I'm dealing with that now. And so I think I've learned to just trust myself to kind of wade into, just to allow myself to exist in a private space before formalizing something.
Can you talk about a work while you're working on it, or does it spoil it for you?
Well, I tried talking about it with John, my partner, often. And Sophia. I think my friend Sophia Samatar and John are the two people I try to talk to most. And Sophia like always gets it. Like, she's always like super, super on my wavelength and gets it immediately. And she's always like, yes, you have to write that. And John gets it more when it's like in pages. Then he'll get it. But just like talking about something can seem very vague.
Yeah, I feel like every writer needs one person that is like, I would call the like, yes, do it person, and the one like, what does that mean? Like, you need both. You need the people that
exactly
need you to explain it, and the one where you're like, I'm gonna write a weird essay that connects like the birth of electricity to like motherhood or whatever, and someone's like, yes, do it. I need it in my face, like, you know.
Totally.
I think the last question I want to ask, and I know we have only just a minute or two, but and it's a big one, so I'm sorry to spring this on you at the end. Someone asked, how has motherhood affected your writing? And I know you don't want to talk about this too much, but I just wanted to ask, you were in the throes of being pregnant a second time, and you had a baby while you were working on this book, and I just wanted to hear sort of that sense.
Well, I feel like there's this line in Rivka Galshin's Little Labors, which I love, where she writes about that she's thinking more deeply than ever since she's had a child, but she has no time to write it down. And I think that dialectic definitely explains what it's like to have a small child. When I had a baby, I actually felt I had a lot of time when I wasn't working, because there was like a lot of empty space. I just didn't sleep. And so I was incredibly productive. But now that I have a very small active child, I maybe get an hour a day to think anything. But, I'm very lucky. I mean, the thing is like, there's that line, Lynn Stager Strong and I were just texting about that line from Jenny Ophil's Department of Speculation, which we love Jenny Ophil. Jenny Ophil is amazing. But that concept of the art monster. I think there's always this either or concept that you can be a mother or an art monster. And I think Lynn and I are both like, we've been way more art monsters since we became parents than before. But the thing is, for me, like, I had already published some, I had contracts. And so then I began to like sometimes pay for childcare. My partner quit his job. So now I have someone who like cooks for me. I never had that before. Like, John makes me food, like before that never happened. And so I get more work done because I actually do much less domestic stuff than I did before. So I'm way more of a monster now.
As all artists do. You have a helper.
Yes, I do. And I didn't have that before. And so when I think about how much I was blocked from writing Driss, I was like, if I had someone who made lunch for me and like kept me company, I would totally write more. And so I'm actually more productive now because I have to almost view my time as more valuable. But that's just a very specific situation with me, in that I think there are a lot of people who don't have an identity yet as a writer once they become parents. And so then it becomes obliterating because we connect value and time to money, right? Mm. But for me, motherhood, I think, has been one experience of caretaking, like other experiences of caretaking, which I think has made me probably a deeper and more empathetic person, but I was also like before a pretty self-involved person. So I've become, that's just me specifically though. But I do think there is a sense that if you become a parent, you don't care about art anymore, or you don't have any existential crises. But I'm just as self-involved and monstrous as I was before. I like care just as much about work and books. And I used to waste a lot of time, and I probably waste less time. So that's it. I guess that's the answer. I think that people often think with motherhood and writing, it's an either or thing. And I think it's actually just incredibly complex and deals with labor and time and how one values time. And I think for that, I think it's been like a pretty transformative experience for me. But there's been other transformative experiences.
And I think the last thing I'll say is right now, I mean, everybody's sort of renegotiating their relationship to time and work. We're inside, we're figuring it out. I mean, the big refrain from so many people now is like, I'm stuck inside and yet I can't produce and all these things. And I think this brings us kind of full circle, because Drifts is a book about being inside and feeling reluctant and yet excited to be creative and grappling with all the things I think a lot of people are feeling. It's like an unexpectedly timely book.
Yes, thank you.
It is. Well, so I want to thank Kate and tell you all to get Drifts.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Beautiful novel. And thank you so much, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you for the conversation. Thank you everybody for coming.
Okay. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.